Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen, and by ladies as well as gentlemen, I mean all two people who are still watching this crazy video series. I do believe we have just one puzzle left, the Prime Factory, in my opinion, the hardest puzzle of the game, and also the most fun. This was like the most satisfying one for me to solve, so I'm really glad to be doing it for you guys here, all two of you. This is a puzzle that when I first saw it, I was like, no way, there's just no way. You have to output the prime factors of each number given. So like 16 is 2 to the 4th power, so you'd output 2, 2, 2, and 2. For 7, you would just output 7, because it's prime. Note that 1 is not a prime number, so we're never going to be outputting any 1s. I was like, prime factors in assembly? There's no goddamn way. But, you know, I kind of sat on it for a week, and then eventually I was like, wait a minute, maybe this can be done. So the solution's actually quite simple. Once you see the puzzle, like how it's done, it's not too bad. So here's the deal. Basically, let's say I take a number like 10. What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide by 2 as much as I can. This will give me 5. Then I'm going to divide by 3 as much as I can, which does nothing. And then 4, which does nothing. And then 5, which gets me down to 1. So then I'll be outputting 2 and 5. Say I have a number like 12. I'm going to divide by 2 as much as I can. So first I'm going to divide by 2, get 6. Then divide by 2 and get 3. Then I'm going to divide by 3 as much as I can. All right, so there we go. Or I'm going to have a 2, and then a 3 at the end. So there it is, the prime factors of 12. If you have a more complicated number, let's say like 20, I'm going to divide by 2 as much as I can. So do it once, I get 10. Do it once more, I get 5. Then I'll divide by 3 as much as I can, then by 4 as much as I can, and then 5, and then there it is. 2, 2, and 5 are the prime factors. So basically, what we're going to have is a factor variable. I'm actually going to go ahead and laboriously spell out the whole word with my mouse here because it's worth it for clarity, to have all the clarity that you can in a tough puzzle like this. It's going to start at 2, then it's going to go up to 3, then 4, and then 5, and 6, and so on. And you might say, wait a minute, Boris. 4 isn't a prime factor, so how do you know that the factor that you're finding is prime? And the key is actually kind of based on the old mathematical principle, what is it called? Sieve of Eratosthenes or something, which is basically that like once you've divided out all the 2's from a number that you can, you're going to have an odd number left over, so it's not going to be divisible by 4 or by 6. Once you've divided out all the 3's that you can, the number's not going to be divisible by 9. So checking against non-prime factors isn't actually going to matter because you'll never come up with those as factors of the number since you will have already gotten the prime factors before them. So that's the idea here. Now, what are the other numbers that we need? Well, this is going to be our 0 variable. It's always going to stay 0. We're going to have a counting variable. Count is going to be really similar to what we used for division. I mean, I guess you could call this like the dividend or something more particular, but basically I'm going to be counting how many times the factor goes into our input. Then we're going to have, let me actually make this the input. Input. Okay, and then this will be the count. I'll spell it out for once. And this will be our temporary place. So the reason we need to have a temp variable here is when I'm dividing something that doesn't actually divide nicely by the factor, I need to keep track of the temp and the input separately. So for example, let's say I get the number 8 and I'm dividing by 2, I need to have the temp variable here. So that eventually it turns into 4 and I copy the 4 into my new input. But say I've got the number 9 and I'm dividing by 2. If I keep subtracting 2's over and over and over again, eventually I'm going to hit a negative and realize, whoops, 9's not actually divisible by 2. But then I will have forgotten that my starting number was 9 unless I was keeping my running count separately from where my input is. So hopefully that made a greater than 0 amount of sense, but we'll see. So what are we going to do? Well, here's our algorithm. We're going to take our input, our next number from the inbox, copy it to the input area. We're also going to copy it, I beg your pardon, that's not what I'm saying. We're also going to copy the number 0 and set it as our current count. We're also going to set up our factor here, which of course is 2, so I'm going to put a 0 in there and bump it twice. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy my input and begin subtracting the factor over and over again. So the way this works is this is how you basically tell whether one number is divisible by another. Say I take 6, I keep subtracting 2 over and over and over, and I get 0 at the end of the day. That's what tells me 6 is divisible by 2. Whereas if I were to do 7 minus 2 over and over and over, eventually I'd end up at -1. If you hit a negative, that means that the big number was not divisible by the small number. Whereas if you hit 0, that means the big number was divisible by the small number. So basically here, I'm going to start subtracting the factor repeatedly to see if my input is, in fact, divisible by the factor. Now, after performing a subtraction, if the result is negative, that means that my input is not divisible by the factor. So what I need to do is I need to just bump the factor up by 1. So from 2 to 3, from 3 to 4, from 4 to 5, etc. Then I need to do some resetting here. I'm going to go ahead and take 0 back, reset my count variable back down to 0. And then I'm actually going to jump all the way back here, where I copy my input and test it against the next factor. So for example, suppose I start with 9, and I subtract 2's over and over and realize, okay, it's actually not divisible by 2. I bump the factor up to 3, then I start taking 9 and dividing it over and over again by 3. So I don't want my input to change if it was not divisible by the previous factor that I had tested. Now, going back here, I subtract the factor from the input. If the result is not negative, then what I need to do is I need to actually have a second check to see if it's 0. So if it's 0, that actually means that I need to do something a little bit different. I actually need to take what I was keeping track of in my temporary area and save it as my new input. So basically, like I say, I have an 8. I subtract by 2 over and over and over until I get to 0, and then I realize, oh, hey, 8 is divisible by 2. So that means I need to take my count variable, which will be 4 at that point, and save it as the new input. So I can now take 4 and start dividing it by 2. Or if I started with 10 and I check against 2, I'll end up with 10 divided by 2 is 5, and then I'll take my 5 and I'll start dividing it by 2. Basically, I want to get all the 2's that I can out of the original number, because otherwise I'll miss some of my prime factors. Okay, so basically, if it's 0, that means that the input is in fact divisible by the factor. So what I do at that point is I, first of all, copy the factor and outbox it. Because that is actually our goal in this puzzle, is to outbox all the prime factors of the original input. Then what I do is I bump the count up by 1, because I did successfully, in fact, subtract an extra factor from my input. After bumping the count by 1, I copy this to the input. So like 8 divided by 2 is 4. I'm going to bump the count from 3 to 4 and then save it as the input. So now my new input is essentially 4. After I save the input, I basically repeat this entire process. I'm going to subtract the factor. And then I'm going to do a little check here. If my input is actually smaller than the factor, I actually need to go back and get my next number, because what's eventually going to happen is I'm going to do like 8 divided by 2 is 4, 4 divided by 2 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1. Once my input is 1, then that means I am done. And the easiest way to check whether the input is 1 is just to subtract the factor from the input and see if it's negative, because 1 minus any factor will always be negative, since the factor starts at 2 and only goes up from there. So if I hit a negative, that means I've actually finished submitting all of the prime factors of the number, because my input is all the way down to 1, and so I can go back to the beginning and take the next number. But if the factor is not negative, then what I need to do is jump here. Which might look a little bit weird, but this is the part of the code that basically resets the count to 0. And takes me back to, copying from the input and subtracting the factor. Because I do need to make sure that my count goes all the way back to 0 at this point, since it previously was set up to whatever the result of the division was. So all I'm doing here is I'm actually jumping over the bump the factor step, because basically, after I do 8 divided by 2 and get 4, I don't want the 2 to get bumped up to a 3. I want the 2 to stay a 2, because now I want to start doing 4 divided by 2. So normally the way I get to this step is here. If I get a negative result, this is where I've confirmed that my initial input was in fact not divisible by the factor. So I need to bump the factor and reset my count and go back here, where I, start dividing the input by the factor. However, here I don't want to bump the factor up, because I have just made a successful division, and it's possible that more successful divisions are possible with the same factor. Okay, hopefully a greater than 0 amount of that made sense. If it didn't, I sorely apologize. But after we make this jump, we're actually done with this part of the code. The only thing that we're missing is right here. So after I subtract my factor from the input, if it's negative, that means it's not divisible, and we took care of that. If it's 0, that means it is divisible, and we took care of that. But what if I don't get a negative or a 0? Like I do 8 minus 2, I get 6. What do I do from here? Well, in that case, what I need to do is I need to take what I'm holding in my hand, the 8 minus 2, which is the 6, and I need to copy it to my temporary variable. I bump up the count because I need to keep track of how many times I was able to successfully subtract the factor from the input. Like basically, you can subtract the number 2 4 times from the number 8. That's what we mean when we say that 8 divided by 2 is 4. Then I go ahead and copy my temporary variable. The reason for this, unfortunately, is that when you do a bump, you have to, the result of the bump goes back up into your hand. So I lose the temporary number that I was holding when I saved it to the temp file. And that's unfortunate because I really didn't want this stupid count to be in my hand at this time, but it has to be. So at this point, I copy from the temp, and I'm going to do a jump right here, where I subtract the factor and repeat the entire process, subtracting over and over until I get a negative or a 0. I really hope this works. Let's go ahead and start it out, shall we? These inputs are really lame, unfortunately. They don't do a very good job showing off the algorithm, but whatever. Hopefully we'll get better inputs for the next stage. So we save our input, we set the count to 0, we set the factor to 2. Now I'm going to take 16 and subtract 2. It's neither negative nor 0, so I save my 14, bump the count, and repeat the process. Notice I'm picking up my temp, not my input, because I already did 16 minus 2. I don't want to just keep doing that over and over. 14 minus 2 is 12, save that. 12 minus 2 is 10, save that. Let's just play this for a little bit. You guys get the idea, I think, here. So watch this temp variable. As it gets closer to 0, we get closer to finding our first prime factor. Okay, so I get down to 0. At this point, my count is 7. However, I actually know that, of course, 16 divided by 2 is 8, not 7. So after submitting the prime factor 2, I bump the count to 8, and I save that as my input. Then I subtract the factor to see if I'm done. I'm not done, so I reset my count to 0 because I don't want this to be 8. That would make no sense, and I jump back here. Take my input, subtract my factor, and let's play this. So watch this closely as it gets closer to 0, the temp. Again, this is a pretty lame input, the 16, because 16 is a power of 2, so there's a whole chunk of the algorithm we're not going to see. Bump the count to 4, because 8 divided by 2 is 4, and the rest of it, I'm just gonna play the 4 straight through, because it's pretty pointless. When we get down to 2, though, we'll do a little bit of work. Okay, so 2 minus 2 is 0, so I have a factor. So I reset my count to 0. Oh, sorry, let's do it. Yeah, there it is. There, I do the subtraction. So I copy the 2, save it. 16 is 2 to the 4th power. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So that's that. I bump up the count, copy to the input, and notice when I subtract the factor, I'm going to get a negative, so that means I'm done. I found all the prime factors of 16, and we go back to here. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through the 8, because it's the exact same thing as the 16. In fact, we literally saw this already while doing the 16. There's nothing interesting at all about this. 7 as a prime number will be a slightly more interesting case. Sometimes this puzzle gives you like 17, which is really obnoxious. It takes forever and a half to get up there. Okay, so here we go. We got 7, which is a prime number. Now what's going to happen is, I'm going to just play this for a little bit at normal speed. I'm going to keep subtracting 2's from 7 for a good long while. Because 7 obviously is not divisible by 2. It's a pretty big number, so there's a lot of 2's that we can subtract out of it. Okay, so now I do 1 minus 2 and I get negative 1. So 7 is not divisible by 2. That's what I know at this point. I jump here where I bump my factor up to 3, reset my count because I don't want the count to be 3. I want it to start at 0. And then I jump here where I take 7 and now I'm going to subtract 3's. And again, I'm going to end up with a negative 1, or not a negative 1, a negative number. So I know that 7 is not divisible by 3. I bump the factor up to 4. This does get quicker with each factor increase, because obviously the bigger you make the factor, the quicker you get down to either a 0 or a negative. So 7 minus 6 is 1. 1 minus 6 is negative 5. So now we get our factor up equal to our input. I do 7 minus 7, it's 0. Perfect. So I copy that factor, which is 7 itself. I outbox it, I bump the count, copy to the input, because 7 divided by 7 is 1. And when I subtract the original factor, I get a negative result. So I go to the inbox, and we're done. Now this is going to satisfy the size requirements. In fact, I beat the size requirements a smidge, but it fails horribly at the speed challenge. And you might know why it fails horribly at the speed challenge. You might say, wait a minute, Boris, why on earth were you doing like 4 and 6 and stuff? Like, clearly, you should never be dividing by 4 or by 6 or by 9 or by 12 or by any other non-prime number, because you're guaranteed to get whiffs on those. So the way that you have to optimize this for speed is, you know, make sure that you don't just bump the factor up by 1 each time. The first time through, when you bump a 2, you should only bump it up by 1 to 3. But once you get up to 3, you should bump it twice. Go from 3 to 5, 5 to 7. And sure, you go from 7 to 9, and 9 is not prime. But at least, you know, if you only do odd numbers, you're not doing your 4s, your 6s, your 8s, your 10s, your 12s, which are all a waste of time. In fact, odd numbers, for a little while, do a pretty good job of mimicking, you know, prime numbers. Up to 20, the only odd numbers that aren't prime are 9 and 15. So you're being pretty efficient there. Now what I'm about to do is one of the most embarrassing things I've ever done in the history of my channel, and this includes all my horrific Hearthstone blunders and everything. I'm gonna do some shitty ass, lazy as hell programming to optimize this for speed. The real way to do it is you need to basically have all your code twice, once for the 2 case, and then like a separate time for the 3 case. So basically the first time through, you bump your factor just once, and then you repeat all this code, and the second time, and all the times through from then on, each time it comes time to bump the factor, you bump it twice. But I'm lazy, and it's not necessary, so I apologize. This is a really, really horrible thing that I'm doing. The computer science major in me is just dying of shame. But this will get you the optimization requirement for speed, which is all we care about, right? Right, guys? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called 2, and we're just going to do this once at the very beginning, because we don't need this thing ever. We don't need to set this more than once. We just create it once, and that's good. Copy it to 2 and bump it twice. Note, by the way, this does make it a little bit easier for us to set our factor, since we have a 2 here. After getting our input, we can copy. See, when we get here, yeah, this is what we can change. We can copy from 2 and just copy 2 factors. So we do save like a little step here, because the first factor is always going to be the number 2. So we do that, and then what we're going to do here is when it comes time to bump the factor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to real quickly copy my factor, subtract 2, and if it's 0, that means if I have the number 2, then I'm just going to bump it once. But if it's not 0, if like my factor is anything other than 2, this jump isn't going to trigger. I'm going to insert an extra bump here. So this is like the easiest way to just make it so that if your factor is 2, then you bump it once, but if your factor is not 2, then you bump it twice, because this bump is going to happen regardless. The only question is, like, do you get to do this bump, which you'll jump over if your factor minus 2 is 0. So I think this should work. If it doesn't, I apologize. We'll just have to debug a little bit and replay it. But this is the easiest way to take your solution from the regular puzzle and add a couple extra lines of code so you're not optimized for size anymore, but to make yourself optimized for speed. So let's go ahead and just run this at fast speed. Again, I have this really lame set of inputs. I don't think it's important enough, you know, to, oh geez, this actually sucks, because for 16 and 8, which are both powers of 2, we don't ever even get to this stuff. We literally never bump the factor. So that was just all a waste of time. Let's take a quick look here. Where are we at? Okay. Gotta do it a few more times. Yeah. Okay. So we pick up our 7. And we're gonna subtract 2 a few times. Boobity boo. Shmoobity shmoo. Okay. So, oh god, I missed it. I'm sorry. Okay. So, here we go. Alright, we're dividing 7 by 2. We've already fit 3 2s in there. We got down to 1. We pick up our 1, subtract 2, and it's negative. So normally at this point what we would do is we would bump the factor up. We'd bump it up to 3. But instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 2, subtract 2, and realize, oh, my factor is currently 2. So I'm going to jump over this extra bump and just bump it the once. And then we're going to, basically repeat all of our same crap. So, blah, 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 subtracting 3s. Okay. So now I'm down to 1. I do 1 minus 3. 1 minus 3. It's negative. So it's time to bump the factor, because 7's obviously not divisible by 3. So I go here. I pick up my 3. Subtract 2. It's not 0. So I don't do this jump. So I bump the 3 up once. And then I bump it up again to 5. So that way I skipped over the 4. And then now I bump it up twice from 5 to 7. And we're done. So that is just a grotesquely lazy and shittily coded thing, because it's just a much better way to do this for speed. Thankfully on this particular puzzle, I guess because they thought it was very hard, the designers were generous. Like, it looks like I did a good job here, because I beat the speed challenge by over 30 steps, but really this is just catastrophically embarrassing that I'm even putting this on the internet, because, creating a 2 and subtracting the factor by 2 is just really lame. After the first time it comes up, no, the number's not 2, I shouldn't have to check it. I should already know that my factor's not 2. So that's why it's much better if you write the code twice. But anyhow, that is it. That's the Prime Factory. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and or subscribe, and I'll see you again soon. Not with more Human Resource Machine, but with other games. Take care, everybody.